What if the very first Vikings weren't the disciplined, fearless warriors we imagine, but the desperate survivors of a forgotten massacre that history tried to bury beneath the Baltic Sea? On a quiet, windswept island off the coast of modern-day Estonia, archaeologists uncovered something that should not exist. Something that instantly shook the foundations of Viking history. Two ancient ships, filled not with cargo, not with treasures, but with the bodies of fallen warriors stacked like timber, frozen in the very positions they died in. Arms twisted, ribs shattered, spines curved in their final agony. For centuries, textbooks insisted the Viking Age began in 793 AD, with the thunder of oars and the burning of Lindisfarne. But the men in these ships died nearly 100 years earlier, long before the world had a word for Viking, long before Europe knew fear. And the wounds carved into their bones whisper stories no saga dared to preserve. Deep slashes that opened skulls, spear wounds driven through rib cages, blade marks that split jaws clean in half. This was not ritual, not ceremony, not the careful piece of a heroic burial. This was a battlefield sealed inside the hull of a ship and buried under centuries of Baltic soil. A moment of violence trapped in time, silent but still screaming. Yet the greatest shock was not how they died, but who they were. Tall, well-fed Scandinavian warriors, armed with master-crafted blades and ornaments made by elite smiths. Men trained for the sea. Men prepared for conflict. Men who should have lived long enough to carve their names into history. Instead, they were erased until the earth gave them back. The men buried in the Salme ships were unmistakably Scandinavian tall, broad-shouldered, well-nourished, and built like athletes conditioned for both endurance and war. Their bones show the marks of training, not labor. Their gear, found scattered around them, belonged to elites. High-quality weapons forged by master smiths, intricate belts, ornate fittings, and clothing decorated with care. These were not peasants. These were not wanderers. They were warriors. And yet, they were not Vikings. Not in the way we imagine. They belonged to something older, a proto-Norse warrior culture still taking shape, decades before the Viking Age would ignite. A world where loyalty was to a warband, not a kingdom. Where the sea was a road, not a barrier. And where reputation mattered more than breath. Among the belongings found in the ships were intricately carved swords, each one a status symbol. Gaming pieces made of whalebone, the kind carried by men who traveled far from home and needed something to pass long nights on the water. Equipment suggesting months, maybe years, of seafaring experience. This wasn't the gear of a quick raid. This was the gear of a mission. But a mission for what? Trade negotiations with Baltic tribes? Diplomatic outreach to secure alliances? A ceremonial display of power from an ambitious Scandinavian chieftain? Or something more secret, a political gamble lost to time? None of the evidence fits neatly. Every clue points in a different direction. And yet all of it becomes even more confusing when we consider one last truth. Whatever their mission was, it ended in violence so sudden and overwhelming that not one of them lived to tell the story. When archaeologists examined the bones inside the Salme ships, a chilling pattern emerged. Dozens of skeletons showed deep sword slashes, wounds that cut through muscle, shattered bone, and ended lives in an instant. Skulls were crushed with blunt force. Ribs were pierced clean through by spears. Arrowheads were still lodged between vertebrae, frozen in their final trajectory. Some men died immediately. Others endured multiple blows from several directions, fighting until their bodies could no longer stand. A few had their faces obliterated, fractures radiating outward in a brutal mosaic of violence, the kind of destruction caused by war hammers or heavy axes swung with intent to kill. And one skeleton told a story unlike any other. A blade driven upward with such precision and force that it sliced through the jaw and split the skull into two perfect halves. This was not a duel, not a raid, not even a chaotic skirmish between rival tribes. This was extermination. A systematic, unrelenting effort to erase an elite Scandinavian warband to the last breath. And the killers? They remain ghosts unidentified, unclaimed by any known tribe or faction. But the victims' final moments still echo in every fracture. raised arms, attempting to block a strike, ribs broken from desperate twists and turns, spines contorted in the agony of last stands. Who were these men fighting? What force could overwhelm a seasoned, well-armed warband long before Europe even knew the word Viking? Someone or something met them on that island with lethal purpose. And whatever happened in those final minutes was so violent, so absolute, that history itself forgot to record it. The more archaeologists studied the Salme ships, the stranger the story became. If the attackers meant to loot the dead, why leave weapons behind, weapons forged with such skill that they would have been worth a fortune? If they intended to take prisoners, why spare the youngest men, leaving their bodies untouched as if they were never meant to be taken alive? And if this had been a treaty meeting gone wrong, a diplomatic gathering turned ambush, why bury the fallen with such unmistakable care? Both ships had been dragged inland, far from the surf, as if someone wanted them safe from the tide. The bodies inside were not thrown in hastily. They were arranged, limbs straightened, spines aligned, valuables left in place, swords, ornaments, gaming pieces, personal items, even falcon bones belonging to a noble. It was a burial, but not the kind we expect. Not chaotic, not disrespectful. It carried intention, almost ceremony. And here lies the paradox. Did survivors from the warband struggle to honor their dead before fleeing the island? Did the attackers, shocked by the ferocity of the battle or afraid of the consequences, choose to treat the bodies with dignity? Or did an older Baltic belief system compel them to bury fallen enemies properly to avoid spiritual retaliation? Because in the ancient world, respect was rarely just respect. Honor was not always kindness. Sometimes it was insurance. Sometimes it was ritual. And sometimes it was fear. A fear that the men who died here still held power. A fear that their spirits could linger. A fear that killing them was only the beginning, and that the land itself demanded balance. The mystery of the two ships isn't in how the men died. It's in how carefully someone tried to silence the aftermath. Radiocarbon dating delivered a shock historians weren't ready for. The Salme burials were not from the late 8th century, not from the familiar dawn of Viking raids on the British Isles. They belonged to an earlier world, roughly 700 to 750 AD, decades before the word Viking would ever echo across Europe. If Scandinavian warriors were already sailing across the Baltic this early, if they were negotiating alliances, testing foreign shores, fighting battles, and dying far from their homelands, then the Viking Age wasn't an explosion. It wasn't a sudden cultural mutation. It was the end point of a slow, deliberate buildup, a century-long fuse burning quietly in the north. So the question changes. Not how the Viking Age began, but why was Scandinavia preparing? What pressure, what fear, what hunger was powerful enough to forge scattered tribes into disciplined warbands into ambitious armies, and armies into legends that would reshape an entire continent? Something was boiling beneath the surface of northern Europe. A transformation invisible in the sagas, but undeniable in the soil. Climate shifts strained harvests. Populations grew. Elites battled for control of trade routes that reached deep into the forests of Eastern Europe and beyond. Young men found themselves standing at a crossroads. Fight, leave, or be forgotten. The Salme warriors marked the moment this transformation began to break through the surface. A sign that the world of the north was sharpening itself long before Lindisfarne burned. A sign that a new era wasn't born in 793 AD, only revealed. Because history doesn't start with the moment the world notices. Sometimes it starts with a forgotten ship, buried in silence, waiting for someone to finally listen. Between the 6th and 8th centuries, Scandinavia was not the land of heroic sagas we imagine today. It was a region under strain, a crucible forging something harder, sharper, and far more ambitious than anything that came before. Climate shifts tightened their grip on the north. Growing seasons shortened, harvests shrank, and winters stretched longer than memory could hold. At the same time, populations rose, pushing villages to their limits. And above it all, tribal elites fought endlessly for dominance, each one seeking the power to control trade, land, and loyalty. Across the east, new trade routes opened like veins of opportunity. running along the rivers of what is now Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine. But these routes didn't reward the cautious. They rewarded the bold, the crews willing to sail into the unknown, risk ambush, and return home with wealth, or not return at all. In this tightening world, young men faced only three choices: submit, starve, or fight. Most chose to fight. A new culture began to take shape, one where honor wasn't just a virtue but a currency, where revenge was a duty, and where wealth measured a man's worth more than lineage ever could. Travel stopped being adventure and became survival. And the sea, once feared as a barrier, transformed into a hunting ground, a place where the ambitious carved their futures. The Salme warriors grew up in this pressure cooker. They were not yet Vikings, but they were the first prototype, the early version of a mindset that would one day thunder across Europe. Men shaped by cold winds, scarce harvests, and constant conflict. Men taught that the world belonged to those willing to take it. But the story of the Salme warriors is not defined by how they lived. It is defined by how they fell abruptly, violently, and far from home. Their deaths mark a pivot point. The moment the crucible's heat produced something new, something the world would soon learn to fear. Who killed the Salme warriors? Who struck down an elite Scandinavian warband long before the world learned to fear men from the north? For over a decade, archaeologists and historians have argued fiercely over this question, yet no answer has fully satisfied the evidence left in the soil. Three major theories dominate the debate. The first points to rival Baltic tribes, fierce fighters who knew their forests and coasts intimately, men who defended their territories with an intensity shaped by generations of conflict. They would not have hesitated to challenge Scandinavian ships landing uninvited on their shores. And they were fully capable of delivering the kind of coordinated, overwhelming violence etched into the Salme bones. The second theory looks inward to other Scandinavian factions. Long before the Viking Age officially began, Northern Europe was a patchwork of competing clans and ambitious chieftains. Early political struggles, shifting alliances, and power grabs may have pushed young warriors to the Baltic in missions we can barely reconstruct. A feud, a betrayal, or a power play could easily have turned deadly. In this interpretation, Salme wasn't foreign conflict, it was a precursor to the clan wars that would later push Scandinavians into raiding abroad. The third theory is the darkest, a diplomatic negotiation that collapsed into an ambush. A meeting arranged between leaders. A gesture of trust. Then a sudden eruption of violence, blades drawn during what was meant to be peace. It would explain why valuable weapons were left behind, and why the bodies were buried carefully rather than stripped or desecrated. An ambush disguised as diplomacy carries layers of guilt, and guilt can compel even killers to honor the dead. Archaeologists discovered weapons lodged in bones that came from multiple cultural traditions: Baltic, Finnic, and Scandinavian. This was not a simple clash between neatly defined groups. It was a boiling cauldron of rival powers, overlapping territories, shared trade interests, and interwoven grudges. A world where alliances shifted like tides, and betrayal was sometimes more common than loyalty. And yet, the burial style complicates everything. The ships were dragged inland. The bodies were arranged with care. Not plundered. Not mutilated. Not left exposed to ravens and wolves. This suggests one of two unsettling possibilities. Either the killers respected the fallen, acknowledging their skill, their bravery, or their noble status, or something interrupted the aftermath. Something forced the attackers to flee before they could strip the bodies or claim the spoils. A second enemy? A sudden shift in the battle? Or an ancient belief that demanded proper burial to prevent restless spirits from haunting the living? Either way, the truth is darker than a simple battlefield. The Salme dead were not just casualties. They were pieces in a larger struggle, a conflict of ambition, fear, and power that set the stage for the world the Vikings would soon inherit. During the same century, the Salme warriors met their end. Another story was quietly unfolding across northern Europe, one that stretched far beyond a single island, a single battle, or a single warband. Norse traders and warriors began appearing along the great river routes that cut deep into modern Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine. These waterways became highways of opportunity, pulling ambitious young Scandinavians toward distant markets, unfamiliar peoples, and dangerous alliances. Archaeology now reveals that Scandinavian presence didn't begin with the Viking Age, it preceded it. Long before the first longship struck England, Norse travelers had already carved a path from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Runestones in Sweden mention early expeditions into the east, hinting at journeys that blurred the lines between trade and conquest. Dendrochronology, the science of tree rings, confirms that timber-built ships, crafted in Scandinavia, ended up thousands of miles away, proof of voyages that demanded skill, bravery, and absolute determination. And artifacts tell their own story. Slavic and Finnic ornaments appear in Scandinavian graves. Norse tools and weapons turn up deep inside Eastern Europe. Strands of culture, belief, and technology began weaving together long before Viking became a name that terrified Europe. The Salme ships fit perfectly into this emerging picture. Their presence on that Estonian island wasn't an isolated tragedy, it was a sign of a larger system already in motion. Trade networks forming. Rivalries intensifying. Powers shifting. Cultures meeting, clashing, merging, and breaking apart. The roots of Viking expansion were not born from sudden aggression or a spontaneous thirst for conquest. They were born from decades of contact, peaceful and violent. From alliances made and betrayed. From young societies testing their reach, pushing their limits, and discovering the wealth that lay beyond the horizon. The Salme dead are not the beginning of the Viking Age. They are the first visible edge of something much bigger. A rising empire still in its earliest heartbeat. Imagine an entire generation of young men raised on the echoes of vanished warriors, stories of those who sailed east into the unknown and never came home. Not defeated. Not forgotten, but transformed into legends whispered around hearthfires during long northern winters. Imagine chieftains slowly realizing that whoever controlled the new trade routes, the routes threading through the Baltic and down the great rivers of the east, would control not just wealth, but power, political dominance, influence, legacy. Imagine fathers looking at shrinking harvests, rising tensions, and a world that seemed to grow harder each year. And instead of urging their sons to farm, they pushed them toward the sea. Not because the sea was noble, but because the sea was survival. From this emotional, cultural, and economic furnace, a new identity began to take shape, one sharper and more ambitious than anything Scandinavia had seen before. A warrior identity forged by pressure. Mastery of the blade, mastery of the sea, loyalty to a warband over the tribe of one's birth, wealth over inheritance, and reputation over life itself. These values didn't appear suddenly in 793 AD. They simmered for generations. They hardened with each political feud and every failed harvest. They intensified each time a ship left and did not return. So, when the first monks at Lindisfarne heard the approach of unfamiliar oars, when the northern wind carried the rhythm of something new, something terrifying, they were not hearing the beginning of a story. They were hearing its release. Because the storm that struck Britain in 793 had been gathering for a century, the Salme warriors, lying silent beneath Estonian soil, were not the spark. They were the first thunderclap of a world about to explode. Europe remembers the Vikings as a sudden storm raiders who appeared out of the mist with blazing torches, sharp steel, and no warning at all. To most of the continent, the Viking Age feels like a lightning strike. Bright, violent, and instantaneous. But for the people living around the Baltic Sea, the truth was far different. There was nothing sudden about it, nothing mysterious, nothing unexpected. They had watched the pressure build for decades, trade deals that began with handshakes and ended with betrayal, river routes contested by rival powers, coastal villages forced to choose between alliance and resistance. Ambitious chieftains, hungry for gold and recognition, pushed their warbands farther from home each year. The Baltic wasn't just a sea. It was a battleground, a marketplace, and a political arena all at once. The Salme ships represent the moment this slow transformation finally became visible. A moment when Scandinavian warfare crossed borders not by accident, not by chance, but with intent. Deliberate, organized, purposeful. These men weren't lost travelers. They were instruments of a broader shift, the early wave of a cultural tide slowly rising across the north. So when Lindisfarne burned in 793 AD, Europe believed it was witnessing the birth of something new. But in reality, it was only witnessing something the Baltic had known for a generation. For those who lived along these coasts, the lightning strike was merely the flash that revealed what had already been forming in the dark. Because the Viking Age didn't start with Lindisfarne. It began with men like those buried on Salme, warriors who crossed the sea before the world gave their culture a name, and whose deaths marked the final calm before a century-long storm. Among the rows of shattered skeletons inside the Salme ships, one figure stood apart. His bones were longer, heavier, unmistakably stronger, the frame of a tall warrior raised on rich meals and privilege, not back-breaking labor. No calluses etched into bone. No signs of a life spent toiling. This man was different. He was buried with an ornate sword, crafted with such precision that it belonged only to someone of status. Near him lay decorated gaming pieces, objects carried by men who commanded, not men who followed. And most striking of all, the remains of a hunting falcon rested beside him. In the ancient North, falconry was not a hobby. It was a signature of nobility, a symbol of elite power. A leader died here, which means a political mission died with him. This was not a band of reckless raiders making a careless mistake. This was not a fight gone wrong during a drunken voyage. The presence of a noble, a man of authority, tells us this mission carried weight, diplomatic, strategic, or deeply personal. His death would have sent shockwaves back across Scandinavia. Imagine the message that returned home. A powerful chieftain's son, or perhaps a chieftain himself, slain on foreign soil. A warband wiped out to the last man. A diplomatic gamble turned to ash. Tragedies like this do not fade quietly. They ignite feuds. They collapse alliances. They push ambitious leaders to seek revenge, to reclaim honor, to rewrite their place in the world. And in a society already strained by climate, competition, and rising ambition, a catastrophe of this scale does more than wound a community. It reshapes it. Sometimes, the death of one leader becomes the spark that turns caution into conquest, and cautionary tales into legend. Because moments like these don't simply disappear into the soil. They transform cultures. They harden identities. And sometimes, they give birth to something far more dangerous. A people ready to carve their name into history by force. When the first Viking ships struck the shores of Britain, Europe believed it was witnessing the sudden arrival of a new terror, a storm that came from nowhere, wrapped in smoke, steel, and fury. But the truth is simpler and darker. The Viking Age was not an explosion. It was an evolution. A long, slow chain of events stretching back through forgotten battlefields, broken treaties, collapsing trade networks, and shifting climates that pushed entire communities to the edge. It was shaped by famine and ambition, by desperation and opportunity, by young men who saw the sea not as a barrier, but as the only path left open to them. The Salme warriors are the missing preface to that story. Their silent graves explain what the sagas never told, that long before Vikings raided across Europe, Scandinavia was already sharpening itself, already testing borders, already learning the hard lessons of violence far from home. Their deaths whisper of a world on the brink, a world where alliances cracked under pressure, where cultures collided, where ambition and fear mixed into something volatile. A world preparing, unknowingly, for centuries of chaos, exploration, conquest, and transformation. Their bones are not just archaeological evidence. They are the echo of a moment when everything shifted. The first spark struck against the flint of history. And once a spark lands in a forest of dry timber, the fire is inevitable. Because the Viking Age was not born in 793 AD. It was born in places like Salme, in the sacrifices of unnamed warriors, in missions that ended in silence, in the tragedies that hardened a culture until it was ready to explode outward across the world. The circle closes here, in the soil of a quiet island, where the story of the first Vikings truly began. History rarely shows us its turning points while they happen, but when we dig into the earth, into ship graves, shattered skulls, abandoned tools, or forgotten camps, we uncover the quiet moments that changed everything. Moments where ordinary men made choices that shaped centuries. Moments where legends were born, not in triumph, but in fear. The first Vikings were not symbols of glory. They were young men trapped in a world growing colder, harsher, and more violent, doing whatever it took to survive. And somewhere in their story, we find a piece of our own. If you want more journeys into hidden prehistory, forgotten migrations, vanished cultures, and the shadows our ancestors left behind, subscribe to Prehistoric Shadows, where every relic tells a story, and every story reveals who we were, and who we still are.